Hey everyone, we talk a lot about our rights as citizens, what we're owed, but what about the other side of that coin, our responsibilities? Today, we're going to dive deep into India's fundamental duties, which is really the citizen's side of the social contract.
And to get us started, just think about this quote from Mahatma Gandhi. He had this powerful idea that rights and duties aren't separate things. They're totally linked. Basically, he's saying that if we all just do our part, our rights will naturally follow. It's a really interesting way to frame it, right?
So let me ask you a question. I bet you could name at least a few of your fundamental rights off the top of your head, but could you name your fundamental duties? It's a tough one for most people, and that question gets right to the heart of what we're going to break down today.
And that really brings us to this big idea. Can you even have rights without duties? See, citizenship is kind of like a social contract. Our rights are what we can claim from the state, but our duties, well, those are our obligations to the very society that makes those rights possible in the first place. Now get ready for this, because it's a pretty surprising fact. When the Indian Constitution was first adopted back in 1950, it had this whole detailed chapter on fundamental rights. But guess what it didn't have? A single mention of fundamental duties. Nope, they weren't part of the original plan at all. So, if they weren't there at the start, how did they get there? Well, the story of our fundamental duties is tied to a really specific and, frankly, turbulent time in India's history. They weren't part of the founding vision, but were actually added decades later as something of a constitutional afterthought. And you can see it right here on the timeline. For 26 years, a whole generation, the Constitution worked just fine without any list and duties. Then bam, in 1976, the 42nd Amendment suddenly adds 10 of them. And it wasn't until way later, in 2002, that the 11th and final duty was added. It's this staggered timeline that's so key to understanding them. So what was the catalyst? Well, it was the internal emergency, which was declared from 1975 to 1977. It was during this period that the government really started arguing that citizens needed to be reminded of their obligations, and this led them to create a special committee to look at constitutional changes. And that committee was the Swaran Singh Committee. One of its biggest recommendations was to add a whole new chapter on fundamental duties. And here's a wild piece of trivia for you. The concept was actually inspired by the constitution of the former Soviet Union, which put a huge emphasis on the duties of the citizen to the state. Okay, so what are these duties? Let's actually look at the 11 duties that now make up Part 4A of the Constitution. You could almost think of them as a kind of moral code of conduct for every citizen. All right, so this first batch is all about patriotism and civic responsibility. You know, the big ones. Respecting national symbols, remembering the freedom struggle, upholding the country's unity, and defending it if you have to. Plus, promoting harmony and respecting women. Then you've got the next group, which covers everything from culture and the environment to our own personal development. These ask us to preserve India's incredible heritage, protect nature, develop a scientific mindset, avoid violence, and basically try to be the best we can be in whatever we do. But remember, that original list only had 10 duties. The 11th one was a much, much later addition. It showed up more than a quarter century after the first 10, which is pretty significant. Let's take a closer look at that one. This one, added in 2002, is directly tied to the right to education. It puts a moral obligation on parents and guardians to make sure their kids get a chance at school. And this is a perfect example of that relationship we talked about, a citizen's right paired with a corresponding duty. So, okay, we have this list of 11 duties, but what's their actual power? Are they just a nice moral guide, or are they legally enforceable commands? This, my friends, is where things start to get a little complicated. So here is the absolute crucial point. Unlike our fundamental rights, which are justiciable, meaning you can actually go to court to enforce them, our fundamental duties are non-justiciable. You can't be taken to court or legally punished just for failing to, say, develop a scientific temper. They are, at their core, moral obligations. And that's the obvious next question, isn't it? If there's no real penalty for ignoring them, do they even matter? Well, the answer is yes, they do. But their power is indirect. And here's how that works. So while the duties themselves aren't directly enforceable, Parliament has passed other laws that give them some teeth. For instance, the National Honor Act makes disrespecting the flag a punishable offense. The Wildlife Protection Act basically enforces the duty to protect the environment. And on top of that, courts can use these duties as a kind of yardstick to decide if other laws are constitutionally valid. But even with that indirect influence, the fundamental duties are still a huge topic of debate. I mean, are they really effective as they are, or do they need a serious update? And that brings us to the conversation that's happening right now about their role. A lot of critics will just dismiss them as a code of moral precepts, nice ideas, but not much else. Some duties, like developing a scientific temper, are pretty vague, right? A huge criticism is that the list feels incomplete. I mean, what about crucial duties like paying your taxes or voting? And finally, the fact that they're just an appendage tacked onto the Constitution makes them feel less important than the rights. And get this, here's a fascinating little detail. The original Swaran Singh Committee actually did recommend making paying taxes a fundamental duty, but the government at the time decided not to include it. It's really telling because it suggests the focus was maybe more on shaping a certain kind of ideological behavior rather than enforcing the practical things that keep a democracy running.
Now, this quote really highlights where the debate is heading. There's a growing voice arguing that maybe it's time to make these duties legally enforceable, with real penalties if you don't follow them. That would be a massive shift from a moral suggestion to a legal command. And ultimately, that's the central question we're left with. What is the real role of duties in a democracy like ours? Should they be an aspirational moral guide to inspire us to be better citizens? Or should they be a set of legally binding rules that compel us to act? The answer to that question really defines what's...
So let me ask you a question. I bet you could name at least a few of your fundamental rights off the top of your head, but could you name your fundamental duties? It's a tough one for most people, and that question gets right to the heart of what we're going to break down today.